Welcome to Tales from the Art Side. Today I'll be creating another character build inspired by the Bioshock series. Bioshock Infinite's Songbird. I started out prepping for this build by going through my bits and junk piles looking for items that I might take inspiration from. Check out this impressive pile. You can almost see Songbird already. To make sure my scale and proportions were correct, I printed out a modified version of Rob Waters' fantastic concepts. I say modified because I did some of my own additions and adjustments after looking at Adam Bolton's final model. One of the major changes was on the leg. I found the original concept was much shorter, drawn more like a human leg, as the final model contained a whole extra sectional leg with a sort of double ankle thing. Using my printouts as a guide, I made some templates and marked out several layers of EXP foam. As a safety note, throughout this build I will often use a respirator, especially when hot cutting, melting, sanding, etc. I don't really want to be breathing that stuff. Once all my foam layers are cut out, I hot glued them together. Then I rough shaped the stack with a hot wire cutter and cleaned up the overall shape with rafts and sandpaper. For most of the filing and sanding process, I actually just took the whole thing outside to keep the dust and other mess out of the studio. As an inner support for the neck and head, I'm using a piece of flexible conduit picked up from a construction site, if I remember right. The lighting for the eyes is made up of red and yellow LED lights, soldered to a remote LED power controller. The neck and head are made up of XPS foam, much like the body. Multiple layers of foam cut and stacked together, then shaped with files. Only for the neck, I sliced it up like white bread to allow for flexibility in positioning the head for the final pose. Once I had all my wiring, neck, and head parts ready, it was time to run all my wires through the body and neck. That shape reminds me of something.
It's smiling at me.
Yeah, that's it. Hey, well, at least I have something bird-like built. Just trust the process. Anyway, I then glued the neck slices onto the conduit frame and marked my eye placement on the head using a very high-tech device known as a soda cap. Once those were marked, it was time to burn in the eye sockets. Well, I get the head glued on, and now what do we have? Some sort of creepy bird embryo thing. Okay. Trust the process, Martha. Now that I've made so much wonderful progress on the body, I'm going to step away for a moment to work on the eyes. To create these, I'm going to do a sort of epoxy painting process, building up the layers of colors. I'm using 5-minute epoxy mixed with colorant and an old paint palette to form the eye shape. Once it was all hardened, it was fairly easy to just lift from the plastic palette. I then used a marker to add a bit more depth and darken the edges. Now for the cracks in Songbird's right eye. We see this event take place right after Booker and Elizabeth fall hundreds of feet into Columbia's artificial ocean, and Songbird plunges in after them. That's when its eye cracks under the pressure of the water. After that, Elizabeth leaves Booker on the beach, dying while she goes dancing. But hey, girls just want to have fun. I made the cracks by carefully placing small pieces of black thread in a pattern that looked, well, crack-like. Then I sealed up both eyes in a final layer of clear epoxy to give them a high gloss finish. A little sneak preview? Yeah, that looks nice, almost stained glass-like. Aww. Wow, that was almost angelic, huh? To build the framework for the arms and legs, I'm using a new approach. These ball and socket stem toys my kids quit playing with some time ago. They worked well. I just had to be sure to reinforce the narrow neck below the ball once I was happy with the pose. It can be a weak point. Oh, look at that, a bird turtle thing. Toot, 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 toot. That's the sound bird turtles make if you didn't know. The more you know. Once I was done playing with the birdle, I laid out my stem toys to see how best to set them up to get the leg proportions correct. I found that used up ink pens fit perfectly into the cut toy pieces, making great spacers. I double checked my proportions, and it's time to snap them into place with a touch of hot glue for a temporary hold to test the positioning for a pose. I don't know, now it reminds me of Voldemort, like in Harry Potter in the Heavenly Train Station and there's a creepy baby Voldemort thing laying there. Martha agrees. Well, trust the process. With the posable Songbird built, it was time to rough out the base, or at least something that I could attach him to, get the pose set and begin working from there. I cut out a few more blocks of XPS foam to fill out the thighs, and hot glued them in place. Hey, look at that! He's actually looking less weird. Now he's Turkey Man, with real basting action. For some reason he never caught on with the kids. I continue to bulk out the legs with various types of foam as well as duct tape. Because it just ain't a proper project without duct tape. I'm sure Red Green would agree, eh? For the joint build out, I ended up using these cabochons. The name for these glass beads Fanciful Devices taught me. I didn't know what they were called in my last video. And also water bottle caps, because the cabochons and the water bottle caps were just the right size. My plan here was to have a damaged spot on the neck exposing the underframe as seen here in Adam Bolton's model. So I carved out an area in the foam and laid in ribs using zip ties. And then I glued some little brass circles in place. We'll have to come back to this area in a few minutes. Before I could finish up this area, I need to work on the large leather strip that lays across the head and neck. For this I used a nearly 1/4 inch thick piece of tooling leather. I cut in a groove line for the stitches and cleaned up all my edges with an edge beveler. After soaking the leather in water, I punched in a few holes and then tacked it in place for drying. And for extra security, I tied it down, giving him a cute Little House on the Prairie look. Laura approves. Once the piece shape was set, I punched in all my stitching holes, then sponged on water in preparation for burnishing the edges and tooling in details. For this, I used a swivel knife with a tip that will both bevel and burnish at the same time, so sort of pillow embossing the leather. And for added details, I use a metal stylus to tool in added pillow effect, wear, and damage. Now back to the neck damaged area I was working on earlier. I filled the area in with a mix of black acrylic and Mod Podge, and then glued in a spring taken from a clicker type ballpoint pen. Following that, I dry brushed it all with a layer of dark bronze paint followed by a bit of silver. It's finally time to get the leather ready for the head and thighs. The leather I'm using for these parts is from scrap buckskin. It will work well to give me that wrinkly texture I want, and is thin enough to stretch as well as fold properly to replicate the look of the leather on Songbird's neck, legs, and arms. And if you're wondering where I got all my leather scraps and tools, well, my father was a saddle maker, and he passed away unexpectedly a few years ago. I inherited his leather and tools. Sadly, we never got to work together on this kind of stuff, so I keep the leather work alive, but in my own artistic way. The layer of stain you see me putting on here is not true leather stain, but Minwax's honey-colored wood stain. I found my leather stain goes on too dark if applied alone, but if I first put on a layer of wood stain and follow it with the leather stain, it works out perfectly. For the dark, nearly black leather on the legs, neck, and arms, I follow the stain process by dry brushing flat black acrylic paint over the top. This not only darkens the leather to match the actual model, but brings out all the great texture on the leather. For all the heavy stitching I will be doing on this model, I'm using artificial sinew. It's nice and heavy and has an appropriate aged look. Once all the stitching on the head stripe was completed, I glued the piece in place using contact cement. This bonds the leather very well, yet still allows it to stretch and flex. On the neck leather, I pushed in some brass nails, trying to match the large rivets along the top of Songbird's neck. I also cut a hole into our left side neck leather to expose the damaged details created earlier. I cut the hole in, then used rasps and other tools to fray and wear the leather around the opening. Dab on a little wood stain to age the leather, and it's time to glue it into place. I wanted to make sure to arrange the proper folds around the neck. This was very important. I needed those folds to mimic the in-game model. I then wrapped the leather onto the thigh and painted the foam black near the seam. I didn't want any pink foam peeking through. I then sewed them up with artificial sinew. Well, we're starting to get this pink bird covered. Looks like he's wearing a mask to go rob a bank or something. At this point I needed to step away from the leather work and get some things arranged for the base. I have sort of a King Kong on the Empire State Building vibe idea in mind for this pose and base layout. So I needed to build the top of what could be a building from the city of Columbia with a large flagpole on top for Songbird to grab onto. I've gathered a bunch of junk and giblets to assemble for the main portion of the flagpole and glue, bolt, and screw them together. I had to do this in an attractive manner, but also be very sturdy to help stabilize the Songbird model. For this, I'm using a handle off a broken pot lid, the top from a giant pixie stick, the blue thing, a base to a light bulb, a rod from a light fixture, and of course a used up eyeliner makeup pencil. I mean, what else are you going to use? For the roof of my destroyed building, I'm going to use a Slurpee cup lid. The problem is, it's a bit flimsy. Luckily my son buys Slurpees enough to keep me well stocked in these goofy domes, so I can stack them together to make a much more durable roof. As a base for the upper portion of my building, I cut a section off of an empty caramel package. Then I glued my domes onto my caramel container and glued some decorative arches on the sides. Who knows where those came from? Just junk I had on hand. And of course, I trimmed out my caramel container to fit well with my newly placed arches. Ooh, heads up! Ooh, could be dangerous around here. Once all that was done, I secured my flagpole to the building roof and glued on some temporary foam legs for positioning. These will be removed later, once I'm sure about the building's placement. With the building set in place, I was able to move forward, knowing where his hands would have to be positioned so that the Songbird model could grab the flagpole for extra support. I wanted to have a section of the left arm framework exposed underneath damaged leather, much like I did for the neck. I removed the dimples on the stem ball joint by covering it in a thin layer of epoxy putty. I then primed and painted the section using the same technique as the exposed neck section. For the arms, I again cut out my leather, stained and painted, and then glued the top and the bottom section together. Using the only appropriate template I had on hand, a shotgun shell, I laid out an area for the decorative stitching and grommets. I punched in the holes for the stitching and the space for each brass grommet. The ones I am using here are 1/4-inch hole grommets from Tandy Leather Company, but I'm sure they can be picked up on Amazon or somewhere else as well. These grommets can be seen here on Rob Waters' concept paintings. Once I had my grommets in place, I locked them in with a small grommet set tool. Then was time once again to tear up the leather, creating a damaged opening near the wrist. Using some small pieces of foam, I bulked up his arms a bit, then glued and stitched the leather over the arm. Let me tell you, with all the hand stitching on this model, my fingertips were sore after this project. But luckily, no hot glue burns, so that was a plus. A little refinement with some stain around the wrist opening, and now it was time to work on the rings around the eyes. For these I'm going to use parts pulled once again from the light fixture I tore apart for the handyman build. I've used these parts from that thing for the handyman, big bot, and now this build. A lot of mileage out of this. Or kilometerage. I don't think that's a word. Well, anyway. I then glued on some rivets and filed some decorative lines into the metal rings to better match what I was seeing from the concept and game model. As a note, the paint I'm using for my metal undercoat is this folk art metallic chocolate brown. I think in my other videos I just called it bronze. Oops, sorry. And for the top coat, I'm using folk art's Inca Gold. These are just cheaper craft paints, but blending them together this way or using them this way gives me the effect that I really like. Now I can finally get the eyes glued into place. I know it's a small thing, but with them in, I feel like I'm actually making progress. Mini victories. With the eyes now in place, I'm able to begin work on the beak. For the life of me, I couldn't find anything in my junk piles that would work, so I decided just to make it out of 1/8 inch thick tooling leather. After cleaning it up a bit and giving it a soak in water, I pinned it on and let it dry. For the eye guards or brows, I cut some pieces from the base of a burnt out LED light bulb. It had a nice shape to it and sort of matched what I needed, with just a little sanding cleanup. And once again, more rivets. I was informed by Persephone's plushies that these things that I use as small rivets are called drills. You know, like Archie Bell and the Drills. If any of you out there get that reference, I will give you a gold star. Except for Leland. He doesn't get one. Let's do the tighten up. Anyway, on with the build. With the brows in place, I moved on to working on the beak, aka rhinoplasty. As with most nose jobs, I trimmed it off a bit and made it look a little more aesthetically pleasing. More rivets or drills, a little paint work, and it's time to glue it all into place. Another victory. For the lower legs, I prepped the buckskin leather much like I did earlier sections, except I had to add in these circular joint openings for the cabochon and bottle cap protrusions. I cut out and sewed on these special round leather pieces that would create the room needed to fit around the larger joints as well as look like what I was seeing in the model. If you have played Bioshock Infinite before, you are most likely familiar with the fact that though it contains many songs that are typical of its time period, there are some songs that are anachronistic, not matching with the 1912 setting. Scott Bradley, the creator of the YouTube channel Postmodern Jukebox, was invited to arrange these anachronistic songs. I would have loved to have the means to license all these songs and play them in the background of this video, the songs that are both period and non-period, but it would have cost too much, and frankly, I ain't no fortunate son. So, I have decided instead to drop references to songs from the soundtrack throughout this video. Hint, so far there's been 2. Now that most of the dark leather on the head, arms, and legs was completed, it was time to focus on creating pieces for the leather bodysuit. For this, I'm using leather that had already been stained from the factory. It just needed a light rub down of additional leather stain to darken it a bit. Once they were cut and stained and stitched together, I asked my wife to sew in some accent stitching with the sewing machine. When you see her hands do cameo appearances, you know she's doing something that, well, I'm just too chicken to do myself. Once she had all the fine accent stitching in, I glued, pulled, nudged, and prodded the suit into place. For the trim that makes up the collar of his suit, I cut out about a half-inch strip of tooling leather and wet and shaped it into a U, and laid out holes for the rivet placement. Once it was glued in place, I took some spent pistol primers and glued them to the heads of some tiny nails. Pressed them into place. I wanted a more standout rivet than the ones created by the drills. Plus, I didn't have to paint these. Another pause to see how things are progressing, and it was time to add the knee coverings. Nothing special here, just circular pieces of leather and, of course, more painful stitching.
My fingers hurt.
Oh, well, now your back's gonna hurt because you just pulled landscaping duty.
It's so tough around here. Let me tell you. Anyway, time to move to the saddle or wing harness. This was created much like the strip over the neck and head. Thick tooling or skirting leather, cut, a seam channel put in, stitching holes, edge beveling, wetting, burnishing, and tooling in details with a stylus such as wear and damage. Once all that was done, a good soak in the water to soften it up for shaping. When preparing for shaping, I tend to soak this thick leather in water until the little bubbles stop coming up. That lets me know the leather is fully saturated and will shape well. As a base for forming this leather, I use an antique power pole insulator, frankly just because I have it. But just about any smooth, rounded, hard surface would do. Of course, I then pinned it into place for drying. And once it was fully dried, it looked much like a turtle shell, or in this case, a birdle shell. I punched in the holes for the 2 large electrodes that protrude from Songbird's back, and glued on 2 leather rings around the holes, adding depth around the openings. These will later get some fine leather lacing wrapped around them as a finishing touch. Now for the attachment points for the harness. For this, I will dive into my D-ring bag. No, not my D bag. Let's just stop that thought right now, especially you, Leland. And pull out 2 brass O-rings. Sorry, I don't have an O-ring bag yet, and 1 steel D-ring. On the steel D-ring, I'm going to use a chemical called Super Blue. This solution will put a nice gunmetal blue finish on most steel or iron. I use it a lot on pieces like this. It should be used with care, and if you ever use it, be sure to follow the directions. I then glued my ring attachments in place, and those brass O-rings not only look great, I didn't even have to paint them, plus they should be strong enough that I imagine those circles will be unbroken. Once again, a layer of honey wood stain followed by the dark brown leather stain. I then took some leather lacing and wrapped each of the electrode openings, giving a nice finish, as well as matching to the Songbird concepts. And on to all the edge stitching. More finger pain, but this time I'm not complaining. I'm really pleased with the way this is turning out. You just never know. For the collar piece that transitions from the harness to the neck, I'm once again using a section of bungee cord, cut down and removing the hooks. I will use those later. And I wrapped the cord with leather, creating a sort of piping along the collar edge. And then I finished the whole thing off by wrapping it in leather lacing as well. I then stained the collar and glued it to the rest of the wing harness. With that done, I now rechecked the fitting with the rest of the model. It's starting to look less and less like a birdle and more like a songbird. I wanted the blued steel D-ring in the back of the harness to better match the nice aged brass of the O-rings in the front. For this I used a bit of gold rub and buff. To use it, it's pretty straightforward. You just, well, rub, then buff. With a combination of the bluing and the rub and buff, I was able to get it to match the others pretty darn well. For the straps that help secure the harness around the legs, I needed some small buckles. And since I didn't have any of the correct size on hand, so I decided to make my own using D-rings. Once again turned to the old D-ring bag and found a couple of D-rings that were just the right size. I placed them into a bath of super glue and wrapped a small piece of baling wire around them to create that piece, the one that I don't even know if it has a name. The part that pokes through the leather. And once again, rubbed and buffed. And as for snap buckles, what else? Dive into the snap bag, of course. Oh, snap. Inside, I found a boatload of perfect snap buckles, but I only needed 3. And as you guessed it, they too got the super blue bath and a good rubbing and buffing. Do you know what happens when you do a lot of rubbing and buffing? You get a gold finger. Maybe I've been working on this project too long. For the harness straps, I cut some leather pieces, wet and curved them into shape and sewed some decorative stitching along the edge. Yes, I did the sewing. It wasn't pretty, but it got the job done. I then riveted my D-ring buckles into place and laid out and punched the holes and glued and buckled it all into place. Remember kids, buckle up. It's the law, and help take a bite out of crime. Once the leg straps were in place, I worked out the length for the shoulder straps, riveted in the snap buckles, and glued them all into place as well. Now I built the pauldrons, or the shoulder pads that come out from under the harness and cover the upper portion of the shoulder. One of the unique features of these shoulder pads is sort of a hinge section that is held together by thick leather lacing. I like this as a design element. I then glued them into place and did some final work on the rear buckle straps, gluing and pinning them into place with brass tacks. With the base of the harness largely finished, I decided it was time to work on Songbird's air supply tube. To create this, I've gathered up a plastic grommet, a brass snap button, some tiny brass nails, an old grease zerk, a small length of bungee cord, and a couple of scrap pieces of leather. I threaded the bungee cord through the hole of the button and glued them into Songbird's beak. From the scrap leather, I made little straps that will act as restraints to hold the air supply tube in place. I glued them down and then used the tiny brass nails as decorative rivets. The grease zerk received a super blue bath and of course a good rub and buff, along with the plastic grommet. I then screwed the grease zerk into the grommet and heated the plastic insulator portion of a small electrical connector to fit over the grease zerk and to act as a junction between the zerk and my bungee cord. Primed the connector and, once again, a little rub and buff. With that, I drilled a hole right into Songbird's belly and hot glued the hose port and tube into place. I think he's like bonded to me now or something. Now I'm going to shift gears for a moment to work on the environment or base a bit more. I've decided to build a Skyhook attachment arm. The Skyhook system plays an important role in moving throughout Columbia and thought it would make a nice touch. For the large portion of the arm, I'm using a windshield wiper adapter. You might recognize these from the Big Bot video. For the thinner part of the arm that extends further out, I don't have any idea what that is or where it even came from, but it worked. I then glued on the clicker switch from a small broken flashlight. Once again, this piece was left over from the Big Bot build. And on the other side of the base, a 20 gauge shotgun shell. I then added another windshield wiper adapter cut and fit into the first one, added a support bar made from armature wire, and glued in some support posts for the plastic bits that will represent pulleys. A little CA glue to fix the pulley in place, and it was time to screw the whole thing to the flagpole. I drilled holes into the metal portion of the flagpole and tried to position it where I wanted Songbird's hand to ultimately be, creating a solid attachment point for the Songbird model. On the building section, I removed the temporary support post and glued and screwed in some stronger permanent wooden posts. I then added some additional pulleys and other giblets to the Skyhook, including a hook and a thick thread representing a belt wrapping around the pulleys. For additional details on the building, I added a bunch of rivets down the roof. The plan is to make the roof appear to be made of brass or copper panels. Then, I added some wood beads on top of each post as a decorative finish. Now that the flagpole is all prepared, it is finally time to work on Songbird's hands. I made these by forming a clump of super sculpey over an armature wire, then adding in additional armature wire for each finger and cutting them to the appropriate length. Then I baked them to harden the palm. This allowed me to further shape and position the armature fingers how I wanted them. I was then able to put clay over each finger and do the final desired sculpting before once again baking to lock in the forms. With the hands sculpted, I once again switched back to working on the base. My plan was to have the base show destruction, as if Songbird had just destroyed a building and is standing amidst the rubble. For this, I simply pulled out all sorts of foam scrap, wood, and other odds and ends left over from previous builds. On a panel of leftover foam, I laid out a brick pattern. I found that just by having the brick pattern embossed in with a dull pencil, I was able to snap the foam wall into nice broken brick wall pieces. I then glued in my pieces, trying to lay them out in a way that showed destruction, yet was still compositionally pleasing. I wanted pretty destruction. So what do you think? Are you starting to trust the process yet? With all the parts glued into place, I primed the base in a mixture of Mod Podge and black acrylic paint. I then went through the base and painted everything in primarily shades of gray, white, brown, a few metallics here and there, and a touch of light cinnamon, just for a hint of spice. Most of this paintwork was just quickly dry brushed. I wasn't looking for clean, nice paintwork. I wanted to capture destruction, and the rough dry brushing helped tell the story. Now it's time to finish the hands. After priming them in black, I laid on a thin layer of brown paint and dry brushed black over the top again. I was trying to match the look of the dark leather areas of the arms and the legs. I then began to build the parts for Songbird's large claws. The first step was to create a strap that fits over the top of the hand, between the fingers, and over the palm. I used glue and epoxy putty to set the hands in place, having the left hand grabbing onto the flagpole. It was nice to have the hands finally done. As the great crafter Bill Making Stuff says, hands are difficult, but claws are easy. Well, so let's get to working on those claws. I roughly formed the claws and the bracket that holds the claws out of, once again, super sculpey. I also sculpted the toes, or I guess the talons, out of sculpey as well, using small electrical connectors as a base or stem that I will be able to glue into other things later. Once they were sculpted and baked, I took them all to the belt sander for final shaping. By using the sander, I was able to really harden the edges and sharpen the points of the claws and talons. Now that the claws were ready, I drilled small holes into them and the support bracket. Then glued them together using a fairly heavy armature wire as a connection bar. I then, of course, primed them in black and painted them with the metallic chocolate brown, followed by a dusting of Inca gold. For the straps that hold the claws on Songbird's wrist, I needed some tiny buckles. Old lacing eyelets torn from a pair of my son's worn-out shoes were just the ticket. I cut several layers of leather for the straps and pinned the buckles onto the claws. I then built up the various parts of the leather, gluing, riveting, and cutting, forming a claw assembly that resembled what I was seeing in Rob Waters' concept art. I wanted them to look both sturdy and functional. I think overall they turned out pretty well. I'm happy with them. With that, another major milestone completed. Now it was time to turn to the talons. Just for a bit more length, I glued some matchsticks into the base of the electrical connectors. In the concept art and model, the talons have these circular joints with a star or wagon wheel pattern embossed into them. I didn't have anything on hand in my bits that would fit what I needed, so I decided to make them out of leather. Using a large leather punch, I punched out 12 leather circles. Let's see if I got the count right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. After wetting, I used a punch to emboss an offset circle onto each piece of leather. I then stamped in a center point, and using a swivel knife, I carefully cut each wagon spoke into place. Yes, it was a bit tedious, but look how wonderful they turned out. I glued the leather wagon wheels onto the sides of each talon. Then, I built up the shape of the foot a bit more to my liking with some epoxy putty cylinders. And with that, I was able to get each of the toes glued into place. I then primed and painted them. I then cut out a few more pieces of buckskin leather, stained and painted them to match the leg leather, and glued them over the feet. Sweet. Another section finished. I decided to quickly jump back to the diorama base just to give it a little more life and story. I glued a handle off a broken zipper to my tower, added a bunting that was meant for the handyman build but got screwed up. Now it fits perfectly here. The bell housing off a light fixture, also originally from the handyman build, to turn my nondescript building now into a bell tower. And a few brass giblets for a finishing touch. Now it's time to work on the pack that controls or powers the wings. It's this part right here, and here, and here. I once again decided just to build it out of leather, or the base form of it at least. After figuring out my template, I cut out 2 pieces from a scrap of over 1/4 inch thick tooling leather. It was easier for me just to cut it with the bandsaw than try to cut it out with my round knife. Once I had roughly cut out the pieces using the saw, I glued them together and cleaned them up with the belt sander. I then gave them a good water bath. Once that was done, I flexed it into shape to fit well with my wing harness and punched in holes for the wing stems. For a decorative finish piece around the wing stem holes, I tore apart a couple of shampoo pumps, extracting these golden rings. They fit just perfect and gave it a nice finish look. I then smoothed the sides of the leather down just a bit with some painter's caulk, glued on some sort of off-brand Lego piece as a decorative giblet, and using epoxy putty formed some L brackets that are both decorative and will aid in the pack's attachment. I then glued on more drills for rivets, and once I had all my rivets in place, I drilled a hole for the placement of a brass center electrical post. I just happened to have the perfect piece amongst all my brass bits. And once again, prime and paint, using the same process as the rest of my painted brass pieces. At this time, I just want to give a special thanks to my Patreon patrons. I've decided to follow Stetson's studio and give credit in song, so here I go. Up Coonin' and the Shillings. That's it. That's all I got. Stetson can sing for like a couple of minutes, man. Oh well, I tried. So I guess please like, subscribe, and join Patreon. Help a brother out. The link is in the description below. Well, anyway, after getting the pack glued and pinned into the harness, I painted up a couple of plastic knobs for the large electrodes that will poke through the harness. I was now able to fit, glue, and buckle the finished harness pack into place. A major milestone. I glued my knob electrodes into place, and for the thick cloth covered wires that connected the 2 side electrodes to the center post, I'm using the wire from this broken set of headphones. The wire worked great, having that cloth covering gave it that cool old-timey look. Yeah, he's really coming together now. He just needs something. Wings. Yeah, he needs wings. Let's get that bird a Red Bull. To create the cloth portion of the wings, I created a paper pattern adding extra room for seam allowance. And once again, not wanting to screw up the sewing myself, I put that pressure on my wife and asked her to do it. And of course, it turned out wonderfully. For the 7 thick ribs laid out across the wing, I cut appropriate lengths of garden drip line and inserted them into the rib pockets my wife had sewn into the wing cloth. These will fill out the pockets and give that nice, bold, strong look. I then did something that may seem a bit strange. To get the color, staining, and aging that I wanted for these wings, I put them through a process that I have done in the past for aging cloth. There are other ways to do it, but this works for me. First, I broke up a bunch of black walnut tree bark and boiled it until I had a nice tree bark tannin soup. After the wings had soaked in the near boiling water for 5 minutes or so, I added a few drops of yellow and brown textile airbrush paints. I did this just to saturate my colors a bit more, but mainly to add a few random splotches of stain here and there. With that done, I pulled the wings out and let them dry. I then began to lay out the frame of the wing with various wires. Once I was happy with their placement, I wrapped them together with thin copper wire and soldered them into place. I then inserted the main portion of my wing frame into the garden drip lines. With the wing frame built, it was time to turn to creating all those cool joints along the wing, starting with the largest joint that attaches to the wing pack and harness. For this, I cut open a broken baby measuring tape. I then gathered several 12 and 20 gauge shotgun shells, cutting off the plastic portion, leaving just the metal base. In the two halves of the measuring tape, I used a rotary tool to bore out holes just large enough for the 12 gauge shotgun shell bases. For the outer elbow joint of the wing, I took a base to a 12 gauge shotgun shell, marked out and drilled holes into the shell and glued it into place. With it now in place, I was able to glue in a smaller 20 gauge shell base into place along with our final outer frame wires. For the smaller joints that fit along the inner part of the wing, I tore the bases off some dried out kids markers and used a soldering iron to notch out spaces for the wire to fit into. I then glued them into place and covered the exposed wire and opening with snap button halves. And for the last of the small joints, another 20 gauge shell base glued in and finished with a couple of spent pistol primers. Who knew Songbird's wings were made of so much recycled ammo? I mean, look at those joints. They look like shotgun shell bases. Anyway, for the exposed wing rib coming off the main stem joint, I went with a piece of armature wire sandwiched between two pieces of leather cut to the desired width. These will give me a good base to glue the edge of the cloth to. For the big gears on the main wing joint, I wasn't sure what to do. Should I make them out of clay or leather? Break down and buy one? I didn't know. Then an amazing thing happened. As I was taking the trash out of the studio, there it was, on a broken lawnmower I was going to throw out. The perfect piece. So now with the gear finally in hand, I was able to move forward with building the main stem joint. For this, I returned to the broken headphones to gather more circular pieces I might need. Then, I cut the lawnmower gear in two. I just now needed the lower section of the main joint, and for this, the bottom of a Yoplait yogurt cup fit the bill. Look at that perfect fit. I then glued my gear halves and headphone parts into place. I did a dry fit to see where the wing frame would need to attach to. Once I'd figured that out, I drilled holes into the gear and shotgun shell base, giving me a strong location to connect my frame wires. I tack glued the frame wires into the drilled out holes, but to really fortify the whole assembly, I locked everything in place using epoxy putty. I just wanted to make sure these wings were sturdy. I continued to use the epoxy putty all the way down the length of the wing frame. This would cover the wires, giving them a nice finish, and also strengthen the entire wing. With the wings now built, it was time to make the wing stems that would attach them to Songbird's body. For this, I threaded a cut down ink pen and a wooden bead with a bit of epoxy putty cupping it onto a piece of heavy fence wire, as well as a small cylinder connects piece and spiral section of the hook that I'd cut off from the bungee cord. This will give a look of a flexible rubber boot. Once it was all assembled, I bent the wires and slid an old castle nut threaded onto a dried out Sharpie marker. I sliced the marker into 4 divisions and using the heat from a small tea candle, fanned them out. Then, with a bit of epoxy putty, I covered the exposed fence wire, giving it a nice finished look. I glued the leather exposed wing rib in place and used tiny screws from the headphones I tore apart earlier and screwed the wing stem assembly into place, and once again used epoxy putty to bond the whole thing together. If you are curious about the epoxy putty I've been using for much of this project, it is this epoxy sculpt from Small Time. I picked up like 2 pounds of it from Amazon. It's not the best sculpting putty, but for large areas that need to be strong, it worked well enough. To cover all my epoxy putty and finish the large joint assembly, I shaped and glued in a part taken from the broken headphones, as well as gluing in the yogurt cup bottom. And for the final centerpiece, I ripped a plastic cap from a nail that I think is used to put a protective sheathing down on roofs. The last piece I needed to build was the wing handle. For this, I once again used the cap from the roofing nail and shaped a thick copper wire to match the handle in the concept art. I threaded the wire through the plastic cap and glued it into place. I then drilled a hole through a small connect cylinder and threaded and glued it into place and capped the holes with some snap buttons. Then, to finish the end of the wire, I glued on a wooden bead. Once all that was done, I once again covered the wire and finished it off with a little epoxy putty. Now that the handle was built, I got it glued on, along with gluing the wing cloth to the exposed leather rib piece. Yippee-yo-ki-yay. The wings are fully built now. Just a bit of priming and painting using the same process as before, and the wings are finally able to go to their home. A major, major victory. I made these wings so that they can be removed if needed, so I didn't glue them fixed into place. So using a strong but thin wire that I pressed into small holes in the center of each wing's main joint, the weight of the two wings counterbalanced each other, thus keeping the wings from rotating or drooping. Hey, it's my own design. If you want to know what the final wingspan is, well, look at that. 35 inches. That's like, let me see, carry the one. That's like, it's a lot of centimeters and like an uncountable amount of millimeters. Well, time now for the last few finishing touches. As a nice solid platform, I glued the base of the diorama to a sheet of hardboard. To cover the exposed foam sides of the diorama, I pre-cut hardboard strips and glued them into place. For the protected corner pieces, I cut 4 leather rectangles, soaked them in water, and after a good soaking I then folded them into shape and let dry before gluing them on with a bit of hot glue. While waiting for the leather corners to dry, I cut more strips of hardboard. My plan is to layer them on along with some popsicle sticks to form a sort of steel girder looking structure. I cut a bunch of my popsicle stick scraps down even further, glued them in, and of course a few googly eyes for rivets. I then primed and painted the base, starting with a layer of metallic chocolate brown, but this time dry brushing a silver layer on top instead of the gold. As a finish pass, I used an eyedropper of burnt sienna oil paint thinned with mineral spirits. This was to add a rusty look along corners and under rivets, places where water might collect and damage the iron. I wanted to give a bit of a light effect to the flagpole Skyhook, something that matched what I saw in the game. With a little bit of hand painting and airbrush, I was able to pretty much get the effect I wanted. Now I needed a flag for my flagpole. For this, I did a bit of an experiment, printing on fabric. The process for this constituted the taking of regular old butcher paper with the plasticky side up and ironing a piece of my fabric to it. Then, trimming it up to match a standard 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper to fit my printer. I then put it in my printer and printed out the flag. It worked pretty good. It was a little faded, but I imagine I could have messed with the settings more if I wanted to. I just ended up touching it up with a bit of marker. I got this process from a YouTube video by Tara Reid. I'll have her channel name in the description below. As you can see, I then went to distressing this flag any way I could, including taking the wood burner to it. I then made a quick post for it using a bit of armature wire and painted gold beads. There, ain't that a grand old rag? Now for the part that made me very nervous, burning in holes into Songbird's wings. North of the Border talks about parts itching when he gets stressed. Well, I don't know about itching, but I had some puckering, if you know what I mean. If I destroyed these wings, oh boy. But it all went well. I then glued in the final rear panel for the wings, and then just one more thing. A shock jockey poster for the brick wall. Well, speaking of shock jockey, yesterday I caught my son chewing on electrical cords. I was shocked. So I did the only thing I could do. I had to ground him. Well, he is currently conducting himself much better now. Well, with that, I think it's time for the final showcase. Good night, Irene. I'll see you in my dreams.
He's coming. You've got to go. You don't want to be here when he gets here.